The whiskey-soaked bartender in Bentonville, Arkansas, leaned across the counter and spoke words that would change everything. "That girl ain't laughed once in all her 22 years, and Lord knows this whole territory's tried." Maxwell Zimmerman had just ridden down from the Ozark Mountains with 3 months' worth of pelts strapped to his packhorse, his shoulder-length dark hair tangled from weeks in the wilderness, his massive frame dusty from the trail. The year was 1871, and the frontier town was bustling with the kind of energy that came from being situated on the edge of civilization. He'd stopped at the saloon for information about selling his furs, not for gossip, but something about the bartender's tone made him pause with his whiskey glass halfway to his lips. "What girl?" Maxwell's voice came out rougher than he intended, months of talking only to his horse and the mountain wind making human conversation feel strange on his tongue. "Daisy Sullivan. Lives with her aunt on the edge of town. Works at the general store most days." The bartender, a wiry man named Pete with thinning hair and sharp eyes, wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "Her folks died when she was just a baby, some kind of accident out on the prairie. Wagon overturned, both gone before anyone could help. Her Aunt Beatrice took her in, raised her proper and all, but that girl's never smiled, never laughed, never shown a lick of happiness her whole life." Maxwell set his glass down, the amber liquid untouched. His calloused hands, scarred from trapping and surviving in the mountains, looked too large for the delicate vessel. "Maybe she just hasn't had reason to." "That's what everyone says at first." Pete shook his head, warming to his subject now. "But it's more than that. Beautiful girl, mind you, real pretty with dark hair and eyes like morning fog, but there's something missing inside. Doc says she's physically fine, can hear and speak just as good as anyone. She just doesn't feel joy, I reckon. Folks have tried everything. Old Mrs. Henderson brought her a kitten once, softest little thing you ever saw. Most girls would have cooed over it. Daisy just looked at it, said it was acceptable, and went back to work." Maxwell found himself intrigued despite his usual preference for keeping to himself. He'd come to Bentonville to trade his goods and stock up on supplies before heading back into the mountains for the winter season. His life was simple, solitary, and he preferred it that way. The wilderness didn't ask questions, didn't require pleasantries, didn't expect anything except respect and vigilance. But something about this story hooked into his chest and wouldn't let go. "Where's this general store?" he asked, draining his whiskey in one swallow and feeling the burn slide down his throat. Pete's eyebrows rose into his hairline. "You're not thinking of trying, are you? Every unmarried man in 3 counties has taken a run at making that girl smile. Some of the married ones too, though their wives didn't take kindly to it. She's polite enough, says thank you and please and all the proper words, but there's nothing behind it, like talking to a pretty statue." Maxwell stood, his 6'4" frame unfolding from the bar stool, muscles rippling beneath his worn buckskin shirt. "Just need to buy some supplies." "Which way?" "Down the main road, can't miss it. Big sign that says Sullivan's Mercantile." Pete watched him go with a mixture of amusement and pity. "Good luck, mountain man. You'll need it." The afternoon sun beat down on Bentonville's dusty streets as Maxwell made his way toward the general store. The town had grown since his last visit 2 years prior. New buildings lined the thoroughfare, and more people bustled about their business. He passed a group of children playing with a hoop and stick, their laughter ringing out clear and bright in the warm September air. A woman in a calico dress haggled with a vegetable seller over the price of squash. 2 men argued about politics outside the telegraph office. Life, everywhere he looked. Joy and anger and frustration, and hope all mixed together in the messy stew of civilization. The general store stood at the end of the street, a solid two-story building with fresh white paint and green shutters. The sign above the door confirmed what Pete had said: Sullivan's Mercantile, ESD, 1865. Maxwell tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped inside, removing his wide-brimmed hat as he crossed the threshold. The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunshine, and it took his eyes a moment to adjust. Shelves lined every wall, packed with goods ranging from flour sacks to farming equipment. The smell of coffee beans and leather and dried herbs filled the air. And behind the counter, writing something in a ledger with careful precision, stood the most hauntingly beautiful woman Maxwell had ever seen. Daisy Sullivan looked up at the sound of the door, and her eyes met his. Pete had been right about their color, a soft gray that reminded Maxwell of morning mist in the mountain valleys. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun at the nape of her neck, and her dress was a practical brown that did nothing to diminish the delicate bone structure of her face. She was beautiful in the way that winter was beautiful, all clean lines and quiet stillness. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice pleasant and completely neutral. "How may I help you?" Maxwell stepped closer to the counter, suddenly aware of how rough he must look after months in the mountains. His beard was thick and untrimmed, his clothes stained with dirt and wood smoke, his hair hanging past his shoulders in tangled waves. "Need supplies. Headed back up into the Ozarks for winter, want to stock up proper." "Of course." Daisy set down her pen and folded her hands atop the ledger. "What specifically do you require?" He listed off his needs. Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. A new skinning knife to replace the one he'd broken in July, dried beans, sugar, tobacco. As he spoke, Daisy moved around the store with efficient grace, gathering items and setting them on the counter. She asked clarifying questions in that same even tone, showed him two different styles of knives so he could choose the one with the better balance, suggested a warmer weight of wool socks for mountain winters. She was competent, professional, and entirely empty of emotion. Maxwell watched her as she worked, studying the way she moved, the careful neutrality of her expression, the precision with which she handled each item. When she'd gathered everything and begun tallying up his bill, he cleared his throat. "Heard something interesting at the saloon," he said, keeping his tone casual. "Bartender said you've never laughed, not once in your whole life." Daisy's hands didn't pause in their work, her pen continuing to scratch numbers onto paper. "Pete talks too much, but he's not wrong. Your total comes to $12.40. "Don't it bother you?" Maxwell asked, pulling coins from his leather pouch. Not feeling happiness. Now she did look up, and there was something in her gray eyes that might have been curiosity. "Can't miss what you've never had. I'm content with my life. I have work, a roof over my head, food to eat. That's more than many can say. Content ain't the same as happy." "Perhaps not." She accepted his payment and counted out his change with the same methodical care she'd shown with everything else. "But it's sufficient." "Will there be anything else?" Maxwell gathered his supplies, loading them into his arms. He was a big man, strong from years of hauling traps and pelts through mountain terrain, and he barely noticed the weight. "I'll be around town for a few days, selling furs, getting my gear in order. Maybe I'll stop by again." "The store is open 6 days a week, closed Sundays," Daisy replied, already turning back to her ledger. "You're welcome anytime during business hours." He made his way to the door, then paused and looked back. She was bent over her work again, pen scratching across paper, completely absorbed in columns of numbers. Sunlight from the window caught in her dark hair, turning it almost blue-black, and Maxwell felt something shift in his chest. "Daisy," he said, and she looked up at the sound of her name. "I'm Maxwell Zimmerman. Reckon you'll be seeing more of me." "Very well, Mr. Zimmerman." Her expression didn't change, but she inclined her head slightly. "Good day to you." Outside, Maxwell loaded his supplies into his saddlebags and stood for a moment in the afternoon heat, thinking. He'd planned to spend maybe 2 days in Bentonville, 3 at most. Sell his pelts, stock up, and head back into the mountains before the first snows came. That was the sensible thing to do, the smart thing. But something about that quiet, empty beauty had gotten under his skin. He led his horse down to the livery stable and arranged for a week's boarding, ignoring the surprised look the stableman gave him. Then he went to the small boarding house on 2nd Street and paid for a room. The landlady, a plump woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd come out from California during the gold rush years, showed him to a clean if sparse room on the 2nd floor. "Bathrooms down the hall. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6 sharp," she told him, her accent still carrying traces of her native Canton despite decades in America. "You look like you could use a hot bath and a good meal. I'll have my son bring up water." Maxwell thanked her and set about unpacking his few belongings. He stripped off his buckskin shirt and washed his face and arms in the basin, studying himself in the small mirror above the dresser. His reflection showed a man just past 30 with weather-hardened features, a thick, dark beard, and eyes the color of pine needles. He looked every inch the mountain man he was, wild and rough around the edges. What was he thinking, trying to make that girl laugh? Pete was right. Every man in the territory had probably tried. What made him think he'd be any different? But even as the doubts crept in, Maxwell knew he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Something in Daisy's gray eyes had called to something in him. Some matching emptiness or loneliness that he usually kept buried deep beneath layers of self-sufficiency and solitude. That evening, after a hot bath that turned the water brown with mountain dirt, and a meal of Mrs. Chen's excellent beef stew, Maxwell walked back through town. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of autumn leaves in the high country. He found himself drifting toward Sullivan's Mercantile, though it was well past closing time. The store was dark, but there was a small house attached to the back of the building, and light glowed in its windows. As Maxwell stood across the street, half hidden in the shadows of a large oak tree, he saw Daisy's silhouette move past the window. She appeared to be washing dishes, moving with that same efficient grace he'd observed in the store. What did she do with her evenings? Did she raid? So. Sit in silence and feel nothing while the world turned around her. You'll catch trouble, lurking in the shadows like that. Maxwell turned to find an older woman standing behind him, arms crossed over her ample bosom. She was perhaps 60, with iron gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Despite her age, she stood straight-backed and formidable. "Madam," Maxwell said, touching the brim of his hat. "Wasn't lurking, just out for an evening walk. And your walk just happened to stop across from my niece's house." The woman's tone was dry but not unkind. "I'm Beatrice Sullivan. And unless I miss my guess, you're the mountain man Pete was gossiping about at the saloon. Said some wild-looking fellow asked about Daisy and seemed determined to try his luck. Word travels fast in this town. Small place, not much else to talk about." Beatrice studied him with an assessing gaze that reminded him of traders evaluating the quality of his pelts. "You looking to win a bet? Because I'll tell you right now, there's no wager worth breaking that girl's heart if she even has one to break." "No bet," Maxwell said firmly. "Just curious is all, curious." Beatrice's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, you're not the first and you won't be the last, but I'll give you credit for honesty at least. Most men come up with prettier words to disguise their intentions. What happened to her? Maxwell asked. The bartender said her parents died when she was a baby, but that don't explain why she can't feel joy. Beatrice's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. You want the full story? You'd best come inside. I was just about to have some tea, and I reckon if you're going to be sniffing around my niece, I should at least know what kind of man you are. She led him not to Daisy's small house, but to a larger home 2 streets over, a comfortable 2-story place with a well-tended garden out front. The interior was warm and lived in, with handmade quilts draped over the furniture, and the smell of baking bread lingering in the air. Beatrice gestured for Maxwell to sit at the kitchen table while she busied herself with the kettle and teacups. My sister Margaret married a man named Thomas Sullivan, Beatrice began, settling into the chair across from Maxwell with a sigh. Good man, hard-working, loved her something fierce. They headed out to make a claim on some land in the Indian Territory, full of dreams and plans. Margaret was pregnant when they left, and I begged her to wait until after the baby was born, but she was determined to go with her husband. She poured tea into both cups, the fragrant steam rising between them. Maxwell wrapped his hands around the warm porcelain and waited for her to continue. They made it to their claim just fine, built a little cabin, and Margaret delivered a healthy baby girl. They named her Daisy after our grandmother. Beatrice's voice grew thick with old grief. But when Daisy was only 8 months old, Thomas decided to take the family into Fort Smith for supplies. It was a 2-day journey by wagon. They never made it. What happened? Maxwell asked softly. Bridge collapsed as they were crossing a swollen creek. Spring rains had weakened the supports, I guess. Wagon went into the water with all 3 of them inside. Beatrice stared into her tea as if seeing the scene play out in its depths. A traveling preacher happened upon the scene maybe an hour after it happened. Found Margaret and Thomas both drowned, tangled in the reins. But he heard crying and found Daisy in the creek bed, caught in some brush that had snagged her swaddling clothes. She'd been underwater, he said, or at least mostly underwater. He pulled her out and she was breathing, but barely. Maxwell felt his chest tighten. She nearly died. Should have died by all rights. The preacher brought her back to Fort Smith, and they sent word to me. I traveled there as fast as I could, and when I first saw her, she was so still and quiet. Doctor said she'd probably suffered from lack of air to the brain, but there was no way to know for sure what damage might have been done. She lived, though, grew up strong and healthy in every physical way. But something was missing. Something was missing, Beatrice agreed. She learned to talk same as any child, learned to walk and read and write. She's smart, organized, good with numbers. But joy, laughter, happiness, all those things that make life worth living, they're just not there. Doctor in Little Rock said it might be damage to the part of the brain that feels emotion, or it might be something else entirely. No way to know for sure, and no way to fix it. Maxwell digested this information in silence, drinking his tea and thinking about a baby trapped in cold water, about the fragile nature of the human mind, about all the ways a life could be damaged before it even truly began. I love that girl like she was my own, Beatrice said fiercely. Raised her the best I could, gave her everything I had to give, but I couldn't give her happiness. God knows I tried. Brought her toys and treats, took her to church socials and county fairs, read her every happy story I could find. Nothing worked. She just looked at everything with those grave gray eyes and said thank you and moved on. Does it bother her? That's the question, isn't it? Beatrice refilled their teacups, her movements practiced and sure. She says she's content, says she doesn't miss what she's never had. but sometimes I catch her watching other people, especially young women her own age, and there's something in her expression. Not quite longing, not quite curiosity. More like she's trying to solve a puzzle she can't quite figure out. Maxwell stood, carrying his cup to the sink. "Thank you for the tea, madam, and for the story. I appreciate your honesty." "What are your intentions toward my niece?" Beatrice asked bluntly, also rising to her feet. "Because I won't have her hurt, even if she can't feel the pain the way others would. She deserves respect and kindness." "Got no intentions except maybe to try and make her laugh," Maxwell said. "Don't know why it matters so much to me, but it does. Can't explain it better than that." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You seem like a decent man, Maxwell Zimmerman, even if you do look like you wrestle bears for entertainment. But I'm warning you now, don't make promises you can't keep. Daisy might not feel things like other folks, but she notices everything, and she remembers everything too. You hurt her, you'll answer to me." "Yes, madam," Maxwell said, and meant it. There was something formidable about Beatrice Sullivan, a strength born of years of loving someone who couldn't love you back in the same way. "I'll be respectful." He left her house and walked back to the boarding house through streets now fully dark, lit only by the occasional lamp in a window and the stars overhead. The night air carried the first hint of autumn chill, reminding him that winter was coming and he should be preparing to head back into the mountains. Instead, he was planning how to make a woman laugh. The next morning, Maxwell woke early from habit, despite having a real bed for the first time in months. He washed and shaved, taking care to trim his beard neat and comb the tangles from his long hair. His reflection in the mirror looked slightly more civilized, though no amount of grooming could disguise the weathered roughness of a man who spent most of his life outdoors. He ate breakfast with Mrs. Chen's other boarders, a quiet meal of eggs and biscuits, then headed out into the growing warmth of the day. His first stop was the fur trading post, where he spent 2 hours negotiating prices for his pelts. The trader was impressed with the quality of the furs, particularly a silver fox pelt that had Maxwell walking away with more money than he'd expected. With coins jingling in his pocket, Maxwell made his way to Sullivan's Mercantile. The store was already open, and several customers browsed the aisles. Daisy stood behind the counter helping an elderly man count out change for a sack of oats, her expression pleasant and neutral as always. Maxwell waited until the other customers had left before approaching. Daisy looked up and recognized him immediately. "Mr. Zimmerman, did you forget something yesterday?" "No, madam. Got everything I needed." He leaned against the counter, trying to look casual despite the nervous energy thrumming through his veins. "But I was thinking, you've probably never been up in the Ozark Mountains, have you?" "No, I haven't. I've lived in Bentonville my entire life." "Beautiful up there," Maxwell said. "Especially this time of year with the leaves starting to turn. Thought maybe you'd like to see it. I could take you up there tomorrow, show you some of the prettiest spots. We'd be back before dark." Daisy tilted her head slightly, considering. "That's very kind of you to offer, but I'm not sure what the purpose would be. I have work to do here." "The purpose would be to see something new," Maxwell replied. "And the store's closed on Sundays anyway. Heard you say so yesterday." "That's true." She studied him with those mist-colored eyes, and Maxwell had the uncomfortable feeling of being thoroughly assessed and found wanting. "May I ask why you're interested in taking me anywhere? We only just met. Can't a man invite a pretty woman on an outing without needing a complicated reason? Most men could, but you're not most men, are you?" There was no flirtation in her words, just simple observation. "You're a mountain man who lives alone and clearly prefers it that way. Yet you're asking me to spend a day in the wilderness with you. It's unusual behavior." Maxwell couldn't help but grin at her directness. Most women he'd encountered would have blushed and simpered or gotten offended. Daisy simply stated facts as she saw them. "You're right, it is unusual for me," he admitted. "But I heard about you not laughing, and I guess I got curious. Thought maybe you just hadn't seen the right things yet." The mountains have a way of making folks feel something, even when they didn't think they could. So this is an experiment. Daisy's expression didn't change. "You want to see if you can succeed where everyone else has failed." "Maybe." Maxwell met her gaze steadily. "Or maybe I just think everyone deserves to see the sunrise from the top of a mountain at least once in their life. What do you say?" Daisy was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant as if calculating probabilities and outcomes. Then she nodded once, crisp and decisive. "Very well. I'll meet you at the livery stable at dawn on Sunday, but I'll need to be back by evening. My aunt worries if I'm gone too long." "Dawn at the livery," Maxwell agreed, trying not to show his surprise that she'd actually said yes. "I'll have everything ready." He left the store feeling oddly triumphant, as if he'd won the first round of some contest he didn't fully understand. The rest of that day and all of Saturday, he prepared for their outing. He visited the livery and arranged for a gentle mare for Daisy to ride, checked his own horses' shoes and tack, purchased food for a packed lunch, and generally fussed over details like a nervous schoolboy. Pete at the saloon found it endlessly entertaining. "You're really going through with this?" the bartender asked on Saturday evening, sliding Maxwell a beer with a knowing grin. "Taking the Ice Queen up into the mountains. Her name's Daisy, and she ain't an ice queen," Maxwell said, more sharply than he intended. "She's just different, that's all." "Different," Pete chuckled. "That's one word for it. Well, good luck to you. Hope you don't freeze to death up there." Maxwell ignored him and nursed his beer in peace, watching the other patrons and listening to the Saturday night revelry without participating. He'd never been much for crowds or socializing. The mountains suited him because they demanded nothing except competence and respect. People were far more complicated. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of perfect autumn day that made everything seem possible. Maxwell was at the livery stable a full half-hour before sunrise, double-checking the horses and packing supplies into his saddlebags. When Daisy appeared out of the pre-dawn dimness, he felt his breath catch. She wore a practical riding dress in deep blue, her dark hair braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, and she carried a small bag over her shoulder. In the soft gray light, she looked like something out of a fairy tale, beautiful and ethereal and slightly unreal. "Good morning, Mr. Zimmerman," she said in that even voice. "I hope I'm not late. You're right on time, and call me Maxwell, please." He helped her mount the gentle mare, noticing that she sat the saddle with easy competence. "You ride well. My aunt taught me when I was young." She believed every woman should know how to handle a horse. Daisy arranged her skirts and gathered the reins with practiced ease. "Where are we going?" "Up," Maxwell said simply, swinging into his own saddle. "Trust me, I suppose I'll have to." She didn't sound concerned, just stating a fact. "Lead the way." They rode out of Bentonville as the sun crept over the horizon, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. Maxwell led them north toward the Ozark Highlands, following trails he knew by heart from years of traveling through these mountains. The path climbed gradually at first, winding through forests of oak and hickory just beginning to show their autumn colors. Daisy rode in silence, but her eyes missed nothing. She observed everything with that same grave attention she brought to her work in the store, noting the wildlife, the changing vegetation, the way the light filtered through the trees. Maxwell found himself watching her almost as much as he watched the trail, looking for any crack in that careful neutrality. After an hour of riding, they stopped to rest the horses near a small stream. Maxwell helped Daisy dismount and led her to a fallen log where she could sit. He fetched water from the stream in a tin cup and offered it to her. "Thank you." She drank carefully, then looked around at the surrounding forest. "It's very quiet up here, different from town." "That's one of the things I love about the mountains," Maxwell said, settling on the ground near her feet. "The quiet lets you hear yourself think. No constant noise and chatter and demands." "Don't you get lonely?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But I'd rather be lonely by myself than lonely in a crowd of people. At least out here, the loneliness is honest." Daisy considered this, turning the empty cup between her hands. "That's an interesting perspective. Most people seem to fear being alone. What about you? You ever afraid of being alone?" "No." She said it without hesitation or emotion. "Being alone is easier than pretending to feel things I don't. People expect certain reactions, certain emotions. When I can't provide them, it makes them uncomfortable. So I've learned to be very good at appearing appropriate without actually feeling anything. It's exhausting." Maxwell felt something twist in his chest at her honesty. "Is that why you agreed to come today? Because I already know you don't feel things, so you don't have to pretend." "Partially." Daisy met his eyes, and there was something almost vulnerable in her gaze. "Also because you didn't ask me to smile or try to tell me jokes. You just offered to show me something beautiful. That felt different from what everyone else does." "Everyone else tries too hard," Maxwell said. "Laughing ain't something you can force. It has to come natural from something that genuinely tickles your soul. Maybe you just haven't found your soul tickler yet." "Soul tickler." The corner of Daisy's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but something close to it. "That's not a real term." "It is now. I just invented it." Maxwell stood and offered her his hand. "Come on, we've got more ground to cover before we reach the good spot." They rode higher into the mountains, the trail growing steeper and the air cooler. The forest changed as they climbed, pines mixing with the deciduous trees, and the undergrowth became thick with ferns and mountain laurel. Maxwell pointed out landmarks as they went: a hawk's nest in a tall pine, a patch of wild ginseng, the subtle signs that indicated bear territory. Daisy absorbed it all with focused attention, asking occasional questions that showed she was genuinely interested. Maxwell found himself talking more than he usually did, explaining the rhythms of mountain life, the way seasons changed the landscape, the delicate balance between predator and prey. "You really love it up here," Daisy observed as they paused at a scenic overlook. Below them, the forest stretched out in a patchwork of green and gold, and in the distance, they could see the rooftops of Bentonville. "It's the only place I feel like myself," Maxwell admitted. "Down in town, I'm too big, too rough, too much of everything. Up here, I'm just right." "I understand that feeling," Daisy said quietly. "Not belonging, being wrong somehow, even though you're doing your best." Maxwell looked at her sharply, hearing something in her voice that might have been the ghost of an emotion. "You ain't wrong, Daisy. You're just different, and different ain't the same as wrong. Philosophically true, but practically challenging." She turned away from the view and remounted her horse. "How much farther?" "Another hour." Maxwell swung back into his saddle, impressed that she wasn't complaining about the long ride. Most town women would have been fussing about the discomfort by now. "The best spot's near the summit." "Worth the climb, I promise." They pressed on, the trail growing narrower and rockier. Maxwell had to dismount and lead the horses in several places where the footing was treacherous. Daisy followed his lead without complaint, picking her way across the stones with careful determination. Her riding dress was dusty now, and loose strands of hair had escaped her braid, but she showed no sign of wanting to turn back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of climbing, they emerged onto a broad plateau near the summit. The view was breathtaking. They stood above the tree line, with the entire valley spread below them like a living map. The sky stretched vast and blue overhead, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine and stone and wild places. "Oh," Daisy said softly, and Maxwell turned to look at her. For the first time since they'd met, her expression had changed. Not quite wonder, not quite joy, but something. A softening around her eyes, a parting of her lips, a tension in her body that suggested she was feeling something, even if she couldn't name it. "This is extraordinary," she said, still in that quiet voice. "I've never seen anything like this. Told you it was worth the ride." Maxwell spread a blanket he'd brought and began unpacking their lunch. "Come sit. We'll eat and rest before heading back." They settled on the blanket and Maxwell laid out the food he'd brought. Fresh bread, cheese, apples, and cold chicken. For a while they ate in comfortable silence, surrounded by the vastness of the sky and the mountains. A hawk circled overhead, and somewhere in the distance they could hear the faint call of a crow. "Why do you do it?" Daisy asked suddenly. "Live up here alone, I mean. Surely it's difficult, dangerous." "It is," Maxwell agreed, tearing off a piece of bread, "but it's also free. No one telling me what to do or who to be. No expectations except the ones I set for myself. And there's something honest about matching yourself against nature. You survive or you don't, based entirely on your own skill and luck." "That sounds appealing." Daisy drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them, gazing out at the view. "No one expecting you to perform emotions you don't possess. No one disappointed when you can't give them what they want." "Your aunt loves you," Maxwell said gently. "That ain't about performance or expectation. She just loves you because you're you, I know." Daisy rested her chin on her knees, which somehow makes it worse. She deserves a niece who can love her back the way she deserves, with warmth and affection and joy. Instead, she got me. I appreciate her, respect her, am grateful for everything she's done. But I can't love her the way normal people love. It's not fair to her." Maxwell moved closer, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Maybe love don't always have to look the same way. Maybe your kind of love, the steady, reliable kind, is just as valuable as the warm, fuzzy kind. Do you really believe that? Or are you just trying to make me feel better?" Daisy turned her head to look at him, and their faces were suddenly very close. "Because I should tell you I don't feel better or worse based on what people say. Words don't affect me that way." "I believe it," Maxwell said firmly. "And I think you feel more than you give yourself credit for. You're here, ain't you? You could have said no to coming, but you said yes. That's a choice based on something, even if you can't name it. Curiosity, perhaps." But Daisy's eyes had softened again, and she didn't move away from their closeness. "Or maybe I'm hoping you're right. Maybe I'm hoping that somewhere up here in these mountains, away from everything familiar, I might find that missing piece, the part of me that knows how to laugh." "Then let's keep looking," Maxwell said. He stood and held out his hand. "There's something else I want to show you before we head back." Daisy let him pull her to her feet, and Maxwell led her to the far edge of the plateau, where a natural rock formation created a sheltered alcove. Inside the alcove, protected from wind and rain, ancient peoples had left paintings on the stone. Faded images of deer and hunters, symbols that might have been stars or spirits, handprints pressed in ochre and charcoal. "How old are these?" Daisy asked, reaching out to trace the outline of a handprint with her finger, careful not to actually touch the fragile artwork. "Hundreds of years, maybe more. No one knows for sure." Maxwell stood behind her, close enough to feel her warmth. "But someone stood here, long before towns or stores or expectations, and decided to leave a mark. To say I was here, I existed, I saw these same mountains and this same sky. It's humbling, Daisy said. All those years, all those lives, and the mountains remain the same, patient, eternal. That's why I love it up here. Reminds me that whatever troubles I got, they're small in the grand scheme of things. The mountains were here before me, and they'll be here long after I'm gone. They stood in the alcove for a long time, studying the ancient art and feeling the weight of history around them. When they finally left to begin the descent, something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship, not quite romance, but a recognition. Two solitary people who'd found unexpected companionship in each other's company. The ride back down the mountain was easier than the climb up, though they had to move carefully in the places where the trail was steep. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and lavender. Maxwell kept a close eye on Daisy, making sure she was managing the ride, but she handled it with the same competent determination she'd shown all day. They reached Bentonville just as twilight was settling over the town, the lamplighters making their rounds and the Sunday evening quiet settling over the streets. Maxwell rode with Daisy all the way to her small house behind the general store, helping her dismount and making sure she was steady on her feet after the long day in the saddle. "Thank you for today," Daisy said, and there was something in her voice that might have been warmth. It was instructive. Instructive, Maxwell couldn't help but grin. "Is that the best word you got for it?" "It was meaningful," she amended, considering. "I appreciate you taking the time to show me those places. I understand why you love the mountains. Can I see you again?" The words came out before Maxwell could stop them. "Not in the store, I mean. Actually see you, spend time with you." Daisy tilted her head, studying him in the gathering darkness. "Why?" "Because I like your company. Because you're interesting and smart and you don't expect me to be anything other than what I am. Is that enough reason?" "I suppose so." She picked up her bag and turned toward her door. "I'm usually free on Wednesday afternoons. The store is quiet then, and my aunt can manage without me for a few hours." "Wednesday afternoon," Maxwell repeated, feeling ridiculously pleased. "I'll come by at 1 o'clock. "Very well. Good night, Maxwell." "Good night, Daisy." He rode back to the livery, returned both horses, and walked to the boarding house with a spring in his step that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Chen gave him a knowing look when he came in for a late supper, but she didn't comment beyond asking if he'd had a nice day. Over the next few weeks, Maxwell established a routine that was entirely foreign to his usual solitary existence. He'd sold most of his furs and had enough money to stay in Bentonville for a while longer without hardship. Every Wednesday afternoon, he met Daisy and they explored the area surrounding the town. Sometimes they rode out to see different views. Sometimes they simply walked along the creek that ran east of town, talking about everything and nothing. Maxwell found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. About growing up in Missouri as the youngest of 6 children, always too big and too rough for the settled life his parents wanted for him. About striking out on his own at 17 to become a trapper, learning the hard way that the mountains demanded respect and knowledge in equal measure. About the peace he'd found in solitude, and the fear he sometimes felt that he'd been alone so long he'd forgotten how to be around people. Daisy, in turn, shared her own stories in that careful, measured way of hers. She told him about growing up with Aunt Beatrice, always aware that she was different but not understanding why. About watching other children play and laugh and cry over scraped knees, and feeling nothing but distant curiosity. About learning to mimic appropriate responses so thoroughly that most people never realized she was only performing emotion rather than feeling it. "Does it bother people when they find out?" Maxwell asked one afternoon as they sat by the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Some people, Daisy admitted. They feel deceived, I think, like I've been lying to them by pretending to care about things, but I'm not lying. I am interested in their lives and their stories. I do want them to be happy and healthy. I just experience those desires intellectually rather than emotionally. Seems to me that's still caring, just a different kind. Maxwell skipped a stone across the water's surface, watching it bounce 3 times before sinking. Not everyone has to feel things the same way. You're very accepting of it, Daisy observed. Most people try to fix me or convince me that I must be feeling something deep down that I'm just not recognizing. You've never done that. Because you ain't broken, Maxwell said firmly. You're just Daisy, and Daisy is perfectly fine the way she is. She was quiet for a long moment, trailing her fingers through the cool water. Then she said, so softly he almost missed it, "Thank you." As October deepened into November, bringing colder weather and the first hints of coming winter, Maxwell realized he was falling in love. It crept up on him slowly, in small moments that accumulated into something undeniable. The way Daisy listened with her whole attention when he spoke, the quiet competence with which she approached everything, the rare moments when something caught her interest and her eyes would light up with intellectual curiosity. He was falling in love with a woman who might never love him back, at least not in the traditional sense, and he didn't care. But he did want to hear her laugh. That had been his original goal, and he hadn't given up on it. He tried different approaches, telling jokes he'd heard from other trappers, creating silly situations meant to be amusing, even attempting physical comedy that nearly resulted in him falling into the creek. Nothing worked. Daisy would watch his antics with patient interest, sometimes commenting on the creativity of his attempts, but never laughing. "You're going to hurt yourself," she told him after he'd tripped over a log while trying to act out a humorous story, and for no real purpose. "I appreciate the effort, but I don't think it's possible for me to laugh. Whatever capacity for that exists in most people seems to be missing in me." "Or maybe it's just buried deep," Maxwell countered, accepting her hand to pull himself up. "Maybe it needs the right key to unlock it." That's a poetic thought, but unlikely based on available evidence. She brushed dirt from his shoulder with practical efficiency. "You should probably give up on this particular quest. It's making you behave strangely." "Behaving strangely is half the fun of being alive," Maxwell argued. "Besides, I like trying. Gives me something to think about besides trapping and survival." Daisy shook her head, but there was something almost fond in her expression. "You're a very stubborn man, Maxwell Zimmerman." "One of my better qualities," he agreed cheerfully. One Wednesday in mid-November, they were walking through town when they passed a dressmaker's shop. In the window was displayed a beautiful gown in deep burgundy velvet, completely impractical for frontier life, but stunning nonetheless. Maxwell saw Daisy step slow as she looked at it, her eyes lingering on the delicate embroidery and graceful lines. "You like it?" he asked. "It's objectively beautiful," Daisy replied. "The craftsmanship is excellent and the color is appealing." "But do you like it?" Maxwell pressed. "If money and practicality weren't issues, would you want to own that dress?" Daisy was quiet for a moment, still looking at the gown. Then she said, "I don't know. I can appreciate its beauty, but I'm not sure if that's the same as wanting it." I've never been very good at identifying wants versus needs. On impulse, Maxwell took her hand and led her into the shop. The dressmaker, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Foster, looked up from her sewing with a welcoming smile. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" "My friend would like to try on the burgundy dress in the window," Maxwell said before Daisy could protest. Mrs. Foster's smile widened. "Oh, that's one of my favorite pieces. Would you like to see how it looks, dear? Daisy looked between Maxwell and the dressmaker, clearly uncertain. I don't need a dress like that. I have nowhere to wear it. That ain't the point, Maxwell said gently. The point is to see if it makes you feel something. Just try it on. For me. After a moment's hesitation, Daisy nodded and followed Mrs. Foster into the back room. Maxwell waited, examining the other garments on display and feeling slightly nervous. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for exactly. That seeing herself in something beautiful might crack through Daisy's emotional walls. It seemed like a long shot, but he had to try. When Daisy emerged from the back room 15 minutes later, Maxwell felt his breath catch. The burgundy velvet fit her perfectly, emphasizing her slender figure and bringing out the warm undertones in her skin. Her dark hair had been loosened from its usual severe bun, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked like a princess from a storybook, beautiful and ethereal and slightly uncomfortable. "How does it feel?" Maxwell asked, his voice rougher than usual. "Strange," Daisy admitted, turning to see herself in the full-length mirror. "I'm not accustomed to wearing anything so elaborate." She studied her reflection with the same analytical gaze she brought to everything, then looked at Maxwell. "What do you think?" "I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," he said honestly, not caring that Mrs. Foster was listening with undisguised interest. "You look like you should be dancing at a fancy ball, not standing in a shop in Bentonville, Arkansas." Daisy tilted her head, still examining her reflection. "It's odd seeing myself look so different. I almost don't recognize this person. But do you like how you look?" Maxwell stepped closer, studying her face in the mirror. "Do you feel anything looking at yourself in that dress?" "I feel confused," Daisy said after a long pause. "There's something in my chest, a kind of pressure. I'm not sure if it's positive or negative. It's just there, which is unusual." Maxwell felt a surge of hope. "That's something, that's more than nothing." "We'll take it," he told Mrs. Foster, ignoring Daisy's protest. "How much?" "Maxwell, you can't buy me a dress like this," Daisy said firmly, finally looking away from her reflection. "It's too expensive and I'll never wear it." "Maybe not today," Maxwell agreed, "but someday. And even if you never wear it, it made you feel that pressure in your chest, and that's worth the price." Mrs. Foster named a sum that made Maxwell wince internally, but he paid it without hesitation, using a good portion of his fur trading profits. Daisy changed back into her practical day dress, while Mrs. Foster wrapped the burgundy gown in tissue paper and placed it in a large box. Outside the shop, Daisy stopped and turned to face Maxwell, clutching the box to her chest. "Why did you do that?" "Because you felt something," Maxwell said simply. "And I wanted to give you that feeling, even if you can't name it yet." Daisy looked down at the box, then back up at him. "I don't understand you, Maxwell Zimmerman. You're spending your money and your time on someone who can't give you what most men want. I can't love you back the way normal women love. I can't make you happy or give you a warm home full of laughter and affection. What are you hoping to gain from all this?" "Your company," Maxwell said. "Your conversation. These afternoons we spend together. That's enough." "Is it?" Daisy's gray eyes searched his face. "You deserve more than enough. You deserve happiness." "Then maybe I'm happy right now, in this moment, standing on a street corner with you while you hold a fancy dress you'll probably never wear." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Did you ever think of that?" Daisy stood very still, not pulling away from his touch. "You confuse me," she said quietly. "More than anyone else ever has. I don't know what to do with you." "You don't have to do anything. Just let me spend time with you, that's all I'm asking." She nodded slowly. "Very well. But Maxwell, you should know that I've been thinking about something. Observing my own reactions and trying to understand them." "What have you noticed?" When I see you, there's an increase in my heart rate. When we're together, time seems to pass differently than it does during other activities. When we're apart, I find myself thinking about things you've said and planning what I might tell you the next time we meet." She spoke as if presenting data from an experiment. "I'm not sure what these observations mean, but I thought you should be aware of them." Maxwell felt his own heart rate increase at her words. "Daisy, those sound an awful lot like the beginnings of feelings. Real feelings, not just intellectual appreciation." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I don't want to make assumptions. I've been wrong about myself before." "You let me know when you figure it out," Maxwell said, taking the dress box from her to carry it. "In the meantime, how about we get some coffee at the hotel restaurant? My treat." They spent the rest of the afternoon at a quiet table in the corner of the hotel dining room, drinking coffee and sharing a piece of apple pie. The conversation flowed easily between them now. Comfortable silence interspersed with discussion of everything from the upcoming winter weather to philosophy, to whether or not the town needed a second church. As evening approached and they walked back toward Daisy's house, Maxwell found himself memorizing details. The way the setting sun caught in her dark hair, the precise way she stepped over a puddle left by morning rain, the slight furrow between her eyebrows when she was thinking hard about something. He was storing up memories, he realized, against the day when he'd have to return to the mountains for good. Because as much as he was enjoying this extended stay in civilization, winter was coming fast, and soon he'd need to make a decision. Stay in Bentonville and try to build a different kind of life, or return to the solitary existence he'd always known. The thought of leaving Daisy made his chest ache in a way that was entirely unfamiliar. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten loneliness could hurt. But now, having experienced her company, the thought of going back to true solitude felt unbearable. At her door, Daisy took the dress box and held it carefully. "Thank you again for this. It was an extravagant gesture." "You're welcome." Maxwell hesitated, then said, "Daisy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If I stayed in Bentonville instead of going back to the mountains, would that please you?" Daisy considered the question with her usual careful thought. "I believe it would. Yes. My life has become more interesting since you arrived. I would miss our time together if you left." It wasn't a declaration of love, but coming from Daisy, it was significant. Maxwell felt warmth spread through his chest. "Then I'll stay," he said, "at least through the winter. I'll need to find work, maybe hire on at one of the lumber operations or see if anyone needs a guide for the mountain trails, but I'll stay." "That seems like a significant life change based on very little reason," Daisy pointed out. "You love the mountains. You said they're the only place you feel like yourself." "I did say that," Maxwell agreed. "But maybe I'm finding that there's more than one place where I can feel like myself. Maybe I can be a mountain man who comes down from the mountains sometimes, for the right person." Daisy's eyes softened, and for a moment Maxwell thought he saw something in them. Not quite joy, but something close, recognition maybe, or the first stirrings of affection. "I should go inside," she said. "My aunt will be expecting me for dinner, but I'll see you Wednesday." "Wednesday," Maxwell confirmed. "Same time." He watched her go inside, then walked back to the boarding house with his mind churning. He just committed to staying in Bentonville, to fundamentally changing his life, all for a woman who might never love him the way he loved her. It was possibly the most foolish thing he'd ever done. It was also absolutely the right decision. Over the next few weeks, Maxwell threw himself into establishing a life in town. He hired on with a local man named Daniel Crane, who ran hunting expeditions for wealthy clients from Little Rock and beyond. Maxwell's skills as a tracker and his knowledge of the mountains made him invaluable, and he quickly became Crane's most sought-after guide. The work was sporadic but paid well, and it gave him the best of both worlds, time in the mountains and time in town. With Daisy, things progressed slowly but steadily. They continued their Wednesday afternoon meetings, but now Maxwell also stopped by the general store most mornings to buy supplies he didn't really need, just for an excuse to see her. They attended a church social together, where Daisy remained politely pleasant while Maxwell felt awkward and out of place among the town's proper citizens. Beatrice Sullivan watched their growing attachment with a mixture of hope and concern. One evening in early December, she invited Maxwell to dinner at her home. Daisy was there too, and the three of them sat around Beatrice's dining table eating roast chicken and discussing the unseasonably warm weather. After the meal, while Daisy was helping clear dishes, Beatrice fixed Maxwell with a stern look. "I need to know your intentions are honorable," she said bluntly. "Daisy might not feel things the way other women do, but that doesn't mean she can't be hurt. She trusts you, which is rare for her. Don't betray that trust." "I love her," Maxwell said simply, keeping his voice low so Daisy wouldn't overhear from the kitchen. "I know she might never love me back the same way, and I'm all right with that. I just want to be near her to make her life better if I can." Beatrice's expression softened. "You're either the biggest fool I've ever met or the best man, I'm not sure which." "Probably some of both," Maxwell admitted. "But I mean what I say. I'll take care of her, protect her, respect her. That's a promise." "And what about marriage?" Beatrice pressed. "Have you thought about that? Because people talk, and if you keep spending so much time with her without proper courtship and marriage, her reputation will suffer." Maxwell had thought about it, constantly. The idea of Daisy as his wife both thrilled and terrified him. Could she even consent to marriage without feeling the emotions that usually accompanied such a commitment? Would she want to, or would she see it as merely a practical arrangement? "I'd marry her tomorrow if she'd have me," he said honestly. "But I don't know if that's something she wants or if she's even capable of wanting it." "Why don't you ask her and find out?" Beatrice suggested. "Daisy might not feel things in the typical way, but she's practical and intelligent. She understands how society works and what's expected. If you explain your feelings and ask her directly, she'll give you an honest answer." Maxwell nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll talk to her." But talking to Daisy turned out to be harder than he'd anticipated. Every time he tried to bring up the subject of their future together, something interrupted or the words stuck in his throat. He, who'd faced down angry bears and blizzards that could kill a man in minutes, was terrified of asking a woman a simple question. Finally, 2 weeks before Christmas, he made a plan. He asked Daisy to accompany him back up to the mountain plateau where they'd spent their first day together, claiming he wanted to show her how different it looked in winter. She agreed readily, always interested in observing changes in her environment. They rode up through the mountains on a cold, clear morning with frost sparkling on every branch and leaf. The trees were bare now, their branches creating intricate patterns against the blue sky. The trail was harder to navigate with patches of ice in the shaded areas, but both horses managed it steadily. When they reached the plateau, Maxwell helped Daisy dismount and led her to the rock formation with the ancient paintings. The alcove offered shelter from the biting wind, and he'd brought thick blankets to spread on the cold stone. "It's beautiful up here in winter," Daisy observed, settling on the blanket and looking out at the view. "Harsher than autumn, but there's a purity to it, everything reduced to essentials." "That's what I've always thought, too." Maxwell sat beside her, so close their shoulders touched. "Daisy, I need to talk to you about something important." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes serious. "All right, what is it?" "I love you." The words came out more bluntly than he'd intended, but once started, he couldn't stop. "I know you might not love me back the same way, and that's all right, but I need you to know how I feel. You're the most extraordinary person I've ever met. You're smart and honest, and you see the world in a way no one else does. These last few months with you have been the happiest of my life." Daisy listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When he paused, she said, "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate your honesty." "That ain't all," Maxwell continued, pulling a small box from his coat pocket. "I'm asking you to marry me, Daisy, not because of what people expect or because of your reputation, but because I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and hear about your day every evening. I want to show you more mountains and teach you how to track deer and learn what makes you feel that pressure in your chest. I want everything, as much as you're willing to give." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring with a small diamond, the best he could afford from the jeweler in Bentonville. Daisy stared at it for a long moment, then raised her eyes to his face. "You know, I can't promise to love you the way other wives love their husbands," she said carefully. "I don't know if I'm capable of that kind of emotion, I know. And I might never laugh, no matter how hard you try or how many silly things you do. I know that too. But I do value you," Daisy continued, her voice growing stronger. "I think about you constantly when we're apart. I find myself wanting to share every interesting thing I observe or learn. When I imagine my future, you're in it. I'm not sure if that's love in the traditional sense, but it's the closest thing to it I've ever experienced." "That's enough," Maxwell said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than enough." "Then yes," Daisy said. "I'll marry you, Maxwell Zimmerman." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then, moving slowly to give her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned in and kissed her. Her lips were cool from the mountain air, and for a moment she was very still, as if uncertain how to respond. Then she kissed him back, tentative but deliberate, and Maxwell felt his heart soar. When they pulled apart, Daisy touched her lips with her fingertips, her expression wondering. "That was my first kiss. Was it all right?" Maxwell asked, suddenly worried he'd pushed too far too fast. "It was interesting," Daisy said. "My heart rate increased significantly, and there was a warmth that spread through my chest. I think I might want to do it again." Maxwell laughed, the sound echoing off the rocks around them. "We can do it as many times as you want. We're engaged now. That makes it proper." They stayed on the mountain for another hour, talking about practical matters like where they would live and when they should marry. Daisy approached it all with her characteristic logical thinking, making lists in her head and considering options. They decided on a simple wedding at the church in early January, just family and close friends, nothing elaborate. As they rode back down the mountain in the afternoon light, Maxwell felt lighter than he had in years. He'd come to Bentonville on a whim, caught by a story about a girl who couldn't laugh, and somehow found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a partner, a companion. Someone who understood his need for solitude, but also made him want to be around people. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Beatrice threw herself into planning with enthusiasm that surprised everyone, and even Daisy got caught up in the practical arrangements. Maxwell moved out of the boarding house and into a small cabin on the edge of town that he'd purchased with his remaining savings. It needed work, but it was solid and had enough land for a few chickens and a vegetable garden. He spent his days making repairs and improvements, knowing that Daisy would appreciate a well-organized, functional home. He built shelves for her books, a desk where she could work on the store's accounts if she wanted to bring them home, and a large window in the bedroom that looked out toward the mountains. Daisy visited the cabin several times before the wedding, always with Beatrice as chaperone to maintain propriety. She walked through each room, taking mental inventory and occasionally suggesting modifications. Maxwell loved watching her plan their shared space, seeing her mind work through problems and solutions. "You should put your trapping equipment here," she said, pointing to a corner of the main room. "That way it's accessible but out of the way. And we'll need more storage for food supplies if you're going to be away on extended hunting trips." "You've really thought about this," Maxwell observed, impressed as always by her thorough approach to everything. "Of course. We're going to live here together for potentially decades. It should be functional and efficient." She turned to look at him, and there was something soft in her expression. "I want you to be comfortable, Maxwell. This is your home, too." "It's our home," he corrected gently, "and I'm already comfortable just knowing you'll be here with me." The wedding took place on a cold January morning in 1872, with snow falling softly outside the church windows. Daisy wore the burgundy velvet dress Maxwell had bought her, and she looked like something out of a dream. Her dark hair was pinned up with pearl combs that had belonged to her mother, and she carried a small bouquet of winter greenery tied with white ribbon. Maxwell stood at the altar in his best suit, purchased new for the occasion, and still feeling stiff and confining. But when Daisy walked down the aisle on Beatrice's arm, all his discomfort vanished. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and he saw something in them he'd never seen before. Not quite joy, but something like it. Contentment, maybe, or peace. The ceremony was simple, conducted by Reverend Thompson with maybe 30 people in attendance. When it came time for Maxwell to say his vows, his voice was steady and clear. "I promise to love you and honor you all the days of my life. To be patient and kind, to listen when you speak, to respect your differences and celebrate them. I promise to be your partner and your friend, to face whatever comes with courage and honesty. I promise to keep trying to make you laugh, even though I know it might never happen. And I promise that my love for you ain't conditional on you loving me back the same way. It just is, and it always will be." There were sniffles from several of the women in attendance, and even Beatrice wiped her eyes discreetly. When it was Daisy's turn, she spoke in that clear, measured voice of hers. "I promise to be honest with you always, even when honesty is difficult. I promise to value you and respect you and stand beside you in all circumstances. I promise to try to understand my own emotions and to share my observations with you. I cannot promise to love you in the way others define love, but I promise that what I feel for you, whatever it is real and important and lasting. You have changed my life, Maxwell Zimmerman, and I am grateful for it." When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Maxwell kissed his bride gently, mindful of the audience but unable to resist. Daisy kissed him back, and this time she didn't hesitate at all. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by various townspeople and dancing accompanied by a fiddle player from a neighboring farm. Maxwell danced with his wife, holding her carefully as they moved through the steps of a simple waltz. She followed his lead competently, but without the spontaneous joy he saw in other couples. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly as they turned in slow circles. Daisy considered the question seriously. "I think I might be. There's a feeling in my chest again, that pressure I mentioned before. But it's not uncomfortable. It's almost pleasant, if that makes sense. Like everything is exactly as it should be." "That sounds like happiness to me," Maxwell said, pulling her a little closer. After the reception, they walked through the snowy streets to their cabin, followed at a distance by a group of young men banging pots and pans in the traditional chivalry. Maxwell waved them away good-naturedly, and they dispersed with laughter and shouted congratulations. Inside the cabin, with the door closed against the cold and a fire crackling in the hearth, Maxwell and Daisy stood awkwardly for a moment. This was their wedding night, and certain expectations came with that, but Maxwell wasn't sure how to proceed. He didn't want to push Daisy into anything she wasn't ready for. "I know there are things that typically happen on a wedding night," Daisy said, addressing the situation with her usual directness. "I understand the biological mechanics, but I'm uncertain about the emotional aspects. I've never felt desire in the way others describe it." "Then we'll go slow," Maxwell said, taking her hands. "We'll figure it out together. There's no rush, Daisy. We have all the time in the world." They did go slow, learning each other's bodies and preferences with careful attention. Daisy approached it all with scientific curiosity at first, asking questions and making observations that would have been funny if they weren't so earnest. But gradually, as the night progressed, Maxwell saw her relax. Her breathing changed, her eyes grew heavy-lidded, and she made soft sounds that suggested she was experiencing pleasure, even if she couldn't name it as such. Afterward, lying in their bed with Daisy tucked against his side, Maxwell felt a contentment so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. This strange, wonderful woman was his wife. They would build a life together one day at a time, and it might not look like anyone else's marriage, but it would be theirs. "Maxwell." Daisy's voice was sleepy in the darkness. "Yeah, I'm glad I married you. I'm glad you married me too." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "That pressure in my chest is very strong right now. I think this might be what people mean when they talk about feeling content and safe and wanted." "That's exactly what they mean," Maxwell murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Welcome to happiness, Daisy Zimmerman." Their first months of marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm. Daisy continued working at the general store several days a week, enjoying the routine and the interaction with customers. Maxwell took on guiding jobs and occasional trapping runs up into the mountains, never staying away for more than a week at a time. When he returned from these trips, dirty and exhausted, Daisy would have the cabin warm and a hot meal waiting. They developed their own rituals and routines. Every morning, they had coffee together before starting their day, discussing plans and sharing observations. Every evening, they sat by the fire and Daisy would read aloud while Maxwell worked on maintaining his equipment. On Wednesday afternoons, they still went on their outings, exploring the area and simply enjoying each other's company. In March, Maxwell came home from a guiding trip to find Daisy standing in the cabin with an expression he'd never seen before. She looked uncertain, almost nervous, her hands twisting in her apron. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, dropping his pack and crossing to her. "Are you hurt? Is Beatrice all right?" "Everyone's fine," Daisy assured him. "But I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you'll react to it. You can tell me anything. I'm pregnant." The words came out in a rush. "I've missed my monthly courses twice, and I've been experiencing nausea in the mornings. I visited the doctor yesterday, and he confirmed it. We're going to have a baby." Maxwell felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. A baby. They were going to be parents. The thought filled him with equal parts terror and joy. "How do you feel about it?" he asked carefully, studying her face for clues. "I'm not sure," Daisy admitted. "Physically, I'm uncomfortable and tired. Emotionally, I'm confused. I don't know if I'll be a good mother, Maxwell. I can't provide the warmth and affection that children need. What if I damage our child the way I was damaged?" "You weren't damaged," Maxwell said firmly, pulling her into his arms. "And you'll be an amazing mother. You'll teach our child to think clearly and observe carefully and approach problems logically. That's valuable too." "But what about love?" Daisy's voice was muffled against his chest. "Children need to be loved, and they'll be loved," Maxwell promised. I'll love them enough for both of us if I have to, though I suspect you'll love them more than you think. You love me, Daisy, even if you don't recognize it as love. I see it in everything you do." Over the following months, as Daisy's pregnancy progressed, Maxwell watched her carefully for signs of how she was handling the changes. She approached impending motherhood with the same methodical planning she brought to everything, reading every book on childcare she could find and making detailed lists of supplies they would need. But there were moments, small ones, when Maxwell caught something different in her expression. The first time the baby kicked strongly enough for him to feel it, Daisy had placed his hand on her swollen belly with something like wonder in her eyes. When they'd set up the cradle in the corner of their bedroom, she'd spent a long time just looking at it, one hand resting protectively on her stomach. In October, their son was born after a long and difficult labor. Beatrice and the doctor attended, while Maxwell paced outside the bedroom door, feeling more helpless than he ever had facing down a blizzard or a wounded bear. When he finally heard the baby's cry and Beatrice called him in, he rushed to Daisy's side. She lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, but in her arms she held a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, and he was absolutely perfect. "His name is Michael," Daisy said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "Michael Thomas Zimmerman, after my father. Is that acceptable?" "It's perfect," Maxwell breathed, reaching out to touch his son's impossibly small hand. The tiny fingers wrapped around his rough, scarred finger, and Maxwell felt his heart break open with love so intense it was almost painful. But he was watching Daisy's face, and what he saw there made him catch his breath. Her usual neutral expression had cracked. Her eyes were wet with tears, and as she looked down at the baby in her arms, her face transformed into something Maxwell had never seen before. Not quite a smile, but close. "So close. Daisy," he whispered, "you're crying." "I am," she said, sounding surprised. "I don't understand why, but when I look at him there's this feeling, it's overwhelming, like my chest might burst open from the pressure of it." "That's love," Maxwell told her gently. "That's what love feels like. This is love." Daisy looked up at him, tears still streaming down her face. "All those years, everyone trying to make me understand, and I never could. But this feeling when I look at him, this is what they meant." "Yes." She looked back down at Michael, who had stopped crying and was making small snuffling sounds. "It's enormous," she whispered. "How do people bear feeling this way? It's almost frightening how intense it is." "You get used to it," Maxwell said, sitting on the edge of the bed and putting his arm around his wife and son. "And it's not always this intense, but sometimes it is, and those moments make everything else worthwhile." Over the following weeks, as they adjusted to life with a newborn, Maxwell watched Daisy discover emotion like someone learning a new language. She was fascinated and sometimes overwhelmed by the feelings that surfaced when she cared for Michael. Fear when he cried inconsolably. Relief when he finally slept. A fierce protectiveness that she didn't quite know what to do with. "Is this what you felt all along?" she asked Maxwell one evening as they sat together, both watching Michael sleep in his cradle. "This constant flood of emotion, more or less," Maxwell confirmed. "Though having a child makes it all stronger. Every parent feels that way. I understand now why people make such foolish decisions based on emotion," Daisy mused. "If someone tried to harm Michael, I believe I would kill them without hesitation or regret. Is that normal?" "Very normal," Maxwell assured her, amused despite himself. "That's the protective instinct. It's powerful stuff." As winter approached and Michael grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, alert baby, Daisy continued to change. The dam had broken, and emotions that had been locked away her entire life began to seep through. She didn't transform overnight into an effusive, demonstrative person. She was still Daisy, still measured and thoughtful in her approach to life. But now there were cracks in the careful neutrality, moments of genuine feeling that grew more frequent as time passed. She smiled sometimes now, small, quick expressions that lit up her face. She got frustrated when things didn't go as planned. She showed affection for Maxwell in little ways, touching his arm when she passed, making his favorite meals, asking about his day with genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. And with Michael, she was openly loving in a way that made Maxwell's heart sing. She held their son for hours, rocking him and singing soft, wordless melodies. She laughed when he made funny faces, though the sound was rusty and uncertain, as if her laughter had to remember how it worked. She worried about his health and development, with an intensity that required Maxwell to sometimes gently remind her that all babies were different, and Michael was thriving. One evening in late November, Maxwell came home from a short hunting trip to find Daisy and Michael on the floor of the main room. She had placed Michael on a blanket and surrounded him with various household objects for him to explore. The baby, now 2 months old, was grabbing at a wooden spoon and making gurgling sounds. As Maxwell watched from the doorway, Michael suddenly let out a loud burp that seemed to surprise him. His eyes went wide, and Daisy made an exaggerated, startled expression in response. Michael waved his arms excitedly, and Daisy picked up the wooden spoon and tapped it gently against the floor in rhythm. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, tap, tap. Michael stared at her, fascinated. Daisy did it again, this time varying the rhythm. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, 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 tap. And then, clearly trying to participate, Michael let out a loud, wet raspberry sound with his lips. The sound was so unexpected and so ridiculous that for a moment there was silence. Then Daisy started to laugh. It wasn't a big laugh, not the kind of full-bodied guffaw that shook the shoulders and made the eyes water. But it was real and genuine and completely spontaneous. A light, surprised sound that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her and spilled out into the warm cabin air. Maxwell stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move or speak or do anything that might break the moment. Daisy was laughing. Actually, truly laughing. Not because anyone had told a joke or created an elaborate situation meant to amuse her. She was laughing because her baby had made a silly sound, and it had tickled something inside her that had never been tickled before. The laughter faded after a few seconds, and Daisy looked up to find Maxwell staring at her with an expression of wonder. "I laughed," she said, sounding as surprised as he felt. "Did you hear that? I actually laughed." "I heard it," Maxwell said, his voice thick with emotion. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, gathering both wife and baby into his arms. "Most beautiful sound I ever heard in my life." "It felt strange," Daisy said, but she was smiling, really smiling, her whole face transformed by it. "But good strange. Like something that was supposed to happen finally did. Is this what you were trying to achieve all along? Back when you first heard about me and decided to make me laugh?" "I guess so," Maxwell admitted. "Though somewhere along the way it stopped being about making you laugh and became about loving you. The laughter was just a bonus." Michael burped again, and this time both his parents laughed together, the sound mingling and echoing through the cabin. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, the kind that Maxwell had been searching for without even knowing it. That evening, after Michael was asleep in his cradle, Maxwell and Daisy sat by the fire as they often did. But this time, Daisy rested her head on Maxwell's shoulder, a gesture of casual affection that was still new enough to make his heart skip. "I've been thinking about something," she said quietly. All those years, people trying to make me laugh, to make me feel. I always thought there was something wrong with me, something missing. But maybe it wasn't missing. Maybe it was just buried very deep, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Or maybe you needed to feel safe enough to let it out, Maxwell suggested. Emotion makes you vulnerable. Maybe part of you knew that and kept everything locked away until you were ready. Perhaps. Daisy was quiet for a moment, then added, "I love you, Maxwell. I know I've never said it before in those exact words, but I do. I love you with an intensity that terrifies and amazes me in equal measure. You taught me how to feel, even though you didn't realize that's what you were doing. You just loved me and accepted me exactly as I was, and that safety allowed something inside me to finally unlock." "I love you too," Maxwell said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Always have, from maybe the first moment I saw you standing behind that counter in the general store, all serious and focused and beautiful." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to coals. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, blanketing Bentonville in white. Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with the quiet breathing of their sleeping son and the steady beating of two hearts that had found each other against all odds. Life settled into a new rhythm after that night. Daisy continued to discover her emotions gradually, like someone carefully unpacking a long, sealed trunk. She experienced happiness and love, but also frustration and worry and occasional sadness. She learned to navigate these feelings with the same methodical approach she brought to everything else, though sometimes they overwhelmed her, and she needed Maxwell's steady presence to help her make sense of them. She laughed more often now, though it was never frequent enough to be commonplace. Usually, it was Michael who provoked it, doing something unexpectedly amusing or clever. As he grew from an infant into a toddler, his personality emerged, curious and determined and affectionate, and Daisy blossomed under his uncomplicated love. Maxwell watched his wife and son with a contentment so deep it felt like part of his bones. He continued his work as a guide, spending time in the mountains he loved, but he always came home eagerly to the family waiting in their cabin. The wilderness still called to him, but it no longer felt like the only place he belonged. When Michael was 2 years old, Daisy became pregnant again. This time, she recognized the signs immediately and approached the pregnancy with less anxiety, having learned that she was capable of maternal love and care. Their daughter, Marie, was born in the spring of 1874, a small, fierce baby with Maxwell's green eyes and Daisy's dark hair. With 2 children filling the cabin with noise and activity, life became chaotic in ways Maxwell never could have imagined during his solitary years in the mountains. But it was a good chaos, the kind that came from a home filled with love and laughter and the ordinary struggles of raising a family. Daisy proved to be an excellent mother, though her style was different from most. She taught Michael and Marie to observe the world carefully, to think through problems logically, to value honesty and directness. But she also, having discovered her own capacity for emotion, taught them that feelings were important and valid, even when they were confusing or inconvenient. "You have to understand your emotions," she told Michael one day when he was frustrated about a difficult task. "But you don't have to let them control you. Feel what you feel, acknowledge it, and then decide what action makes the most sense." It was vintage Daisy, combining emotion and logic in a way that was uniquely her own. As the years passed, Maxwell and Daisy built a life that was rich and full in ways neither of them had imagined possible. They expanded the cabin as their family grew, adding rooms and improvements. Maxwell eventually scaled back his guiding work to spend more time at home, though he still made occasional trips into the mountains, sometimes taking Michael with him as the boy grew older. The general store thrived under Beatrice's continued management, and eventually, Michael showed interest in learning the business. Daisy taught him accounting and inventory management with the same patience she'd once shown to customers. Marie, as she grew, proved to have her mother's analytical mind and her father's love of the outdoors. She was happiest with a book in one hand and a walking stick in the other, exploring the woods around their home and cataloging every plant and creature she encountered. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Maxwell took Daisy back up to the mountain plateau where he'd proposed. It was September again, the same season when they'd first met, and the mountains were ablaze with autumn color. They stood in the alcove with the ancient paintings, just the two of them, having left the children with Beatrice for the weekend. "You remember what you said to me up here?" Maxwell asked, holding both her hands in his. "When I asked you to marry me, I said I couldn't promise to love you the way other wives love their husbands," Daisy replied. "I said I didn't know if I was capable of that kind of emotion." "And now," Daisy smiled, the expression coming easily now after years of practice, "now I know I was wrong. I do love you that way, probably more intensely than many people love their spouses. It just took me a while to recognize and understand the feeling. You were patient with me." "Wasn't patience," Maxwell said. "Was love. I loved you enough for both of us until you figured out how to love yourself." "That's a very romantic sentiment," Daisy observed, and there was warmth in her voice. "You've become quite eloquent over the years. Living with you has improved me in all kinds of ways." Maxwell pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying a rough mountain man who dragged you out of your comfortable, organized life?" "Never." Daisy pulled back to look at him seriously. "You gave me everything I didn't know I was missing. Emotion, love, laughter, family. A life that's messy and chaotic and absolutely wonderful. I wouldn't change a single thing." "Not even the time Michael put a frog in your sewing basket," Daisy laughed, the sound as bright and clear as a bell. "Well, perhaps I would change that particular incident. I still maintain that he inherited that mischievous streak from you." They stood together on the mountain, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from their differences. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, patient and eternal, bearing witness to their love. Far below, in the town of Bentonville, their children were safe with Beatrice, probably listening to stories or helping bake cookies. The cabin they'd built together sat waiting for their return, warm and welcoming. A whole life, rich with love and family and possibility, stretched out before them. Maxwell Zimmerman had come to town all those years ago, intrigued by the story of a woman who'd never laughed. He'd made it his mission to hear that sound, never imagining that in the process he'd find his soulmate, his family, his home. And Daisy, who'd lived her whole life believing she was broken, had discovered that she wasn't missing pieces at all. She just needed the right person to help her find them, to love her patiently while she figured out how to love him back. In the end, they'd both gotten far more than they'd been looking for. Not just laughter, though that came eventually and often. Not just love, though they had that in abundance. But partnership, understanding, and the profound comfort of being truly known by another person. As the sun set over the Ozark Mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Maxwell and Daisy headed back down the trail toward home, toward their children and their life together, toward whatever the future held, facing it side by side the way they'd face everything from now on. Together, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the evening breeze, the sound of Daisy's laughter echoed through the mountains, free and joyful and completely, wonderfully real.